Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Night Live with Aish New York. And my name is Saj Freiberg, and I'm your host for this session and this presentation. The title of our show is What is Morality and Why Should We Care? And the inspiration really for this show tonight um, is the unfortunate loss of Rabbi Sacks um, last week and a little bit before last week. Rabbi Lord Sacks was a towering figure on the Jewish scene, and he had just published a book, September 1st, 2020, I believe is the publishing date, 2 months ago, about morality. The title was Morality. The full title, oh, I don't have it in front of me. Let me just give me 1 second. Do we have an image, Adam, to bring up on that? I'm about to quote from the book itself, but the full title is Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. So this book by the late Lord Sacks is really part of our inspiration to think about him a little bit and to be inspired by his book to discuss the issue of morality. Just reading from his introduction, Rabbi Sacks said the following thing: a free society is a moral achievement. Over the past 50 years in the West, this truth has been forgotten, ignored, or denied. That is why today liberal democracy is at risk. Societal freedom cannot be sustained by market economics and liberal democratic politics alone. It needs a third element: morality. He goes on to say the market will be merciless. Politics will be deceiving, divisive, confrontational, and extreme. People will feel anxious, uncertain, fearful, aggressive, unstable, unrooted, and unloved. They will focus on promoting themselves instead of the one thing that will give them lasting happiness, making life better for others. People will be, by historic standards, financially rich, but emotionally poor. Freedom itself will be at risk from the far right and the far left. The far right dreaming of a golden age that never was, the far left dreaming of a utopia that will never be. And the only way we can avoid this dystopia, according to Rabbi Sacks, is a return to morality. So we're very, very happy to have a very special guest helping us discuss this topic and enlarge on this topic, Professor Paul Franks of Yale University. Professor Franks is a professor of philosophy and Judaic studies, as well as religious studies and Germanic language and literature at Yale University. He works on Kantian and post-Kantian metaphysics and epistemology and Jewish philosophy, and he is currently writing a book on the contribution of Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah to modern European philosophy. He's an illustrious graduate of many wonderful universities, Oxford and Harvard, and also Gateshead Yeshiva, although Yeshiva is a bit different. I guess somebody never graduates from that. But without further ado, let me please introduce to Thursday Night Live and bring on Professor Paul Franks.
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me.
It's a real pleasure and a privilege. Thank you for being here to discuss Lord Sacks and morality in general. I wanted to begin by asking you how you knew Rabbi Sacks. We talked a little bit before the show about how you came in contact with him. It seems that you had some personal contact with him. And what was he like? And in your opinion, why was he considered, what made him an authority on the issue of morality?
Well, I think in the first place, he was just an incredibly warm person. And no matter how much of a celebrity he was, no matter how much he was spending his time with princes and kings and queens and elevated to the House of Lords and so on, he always was extremely personable and always asked about how you were in the most direct way. When he was talking to you, you were the only person in the room who really mattered. And for me, he was an especially important example. I think I first encountered him, as far as I recall, when I was probably a teenager, and he and I had a lot in common. I was a yeshiva student who was extremely interested in philosophy. I didn't know a lot of people who did both of those things. I knew philosophers and I knew people in yeshiva, and I knew a lot of rabbis, having grown up in the Torah center of Europe in northern England. I didn't know anybody who did both. And it was wonderful to encounter him. And he was extremely friendly to me and encouraging. And I remember a lovely Shabbos meal with him and his wife and his children. And he invited me to speak at his shul and really encouraged me to go down the path that I have gone down since then. But I think, obviously he's a great loss to his family and to all the people he mentored and to the British community. But much more than that, he managed to achieve something that I think no rabbi probably in history has ever done. He became the rabbi of the whole of the United Kingdom and, in a way, of the world. In Britain, his voice became incredibly familiar. He would speak regularly on the BBC, on the radio, and he did what was called Thought. It's called Thought for the Day, and he's addressing everybody. It's not particularly to Jews, and he also gave the Wreath lectures, which are the most important lectures under the aegis of the BBC. And I think after he retired from his position as chief rabbi, he really reached out across the Atlantic in particular and just became a sort of global figure, a great public thinker and a moral authority, in the sense that he exemplified being present to people. And he thought really hard about problems that people care about. The book Morality is largely based on a BBC radio series, which everyone can listen to as a podcast if they would like. And,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and my favorite part of those shows, he interviews lots of people, but my favorite part in each podcast is when he talks to high school students. And they have a conversation about morality, and it's wonderful, and they just feel completely comfortable with him. So I think he came to embody a sort of moral authority, not in the sense of telling people what to do, but in the sense of listening to them and listening to their concerns.
And do you think that his background, having done postgraduate study at Oxford and his a deep love and familiarity with secular philosophy helped him achieve that universal? He broke out of, as you say, just the Jewish milieu and became sort of a spokesman for morality in general. I think, how do you think that came about?
Question that his study, he was a student of Bernard Williams, whom I also knew, who was one of the major ethicists in Anglo-American philosophy. But I have to add to that something that Rabbi Sack says in the book Morality. He says, I learned much more about morality from being a rabbi and going to funerals than I did from my teachers at Oxford and Cambridge. Wow. And I think that's right. And I don't think there's anything disparaging about that. And that perhaps will bring us to some issues about what morality is for him. I don't think it's surprising that you would learn more about morality itself from listening to what people say about what they value about other people than you would from moral philosophy, which deals with rather abstract, perhaps very important and rigorous questions. But they're not going to tell you about what morality is in the sense of which moral values you should love or anything like that. They're going to teach you very sort of sophisticated structural issues and to engage in rigorous argument. And I think he certainly did learn those things as well.
It's fascinating to hear a professor of philosophy, talk about the value of going to funerals as where a person would learn morality. I think that says something about the subject that we're talking about. One of the central themes of the book is that we are living in an age where there is less morality, where we are now. Now, obviously, each age does somehow feel that morality seems to be slipping away from it. In your opinion, do you agree with that basic premise in his book, that we are experiencing a loss of morality, especially focusing on the U.S. and the U.K., or is this just the common refrain that's always existed throughout history?
I'm sure it's been a complaint with justification before, but I certainly agree that it is a big problem now. And I want to be very clear about what his lament is. It's not about people being immoral. It's that the necessary conditions for having a morality are declining, and that we all stand to lose from that.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So I think it's very important, first of all, to distinguish between morality and ethics. Morality is a modern notion. There is no word for morality in Greek or in Hebrew. It is not in the ancient world at all. And it is a modern concept, and it is a modern achievement. And it dates really from the late 18th century through the 19th and the 20th.
Wow, it's that recent.
Yes. So look, there's always been ethics. People have always worried about what is the right thing to do, and they have put that in various ways. But in general, they have spoken from within the ethical code of a particular society or of a particular community, whether it's a religious or a political or some other sort of community.
How did this modern concept of morality emerge? What does it mean?
So let's suppose that we're living in a society with many different communities, many different faiths, and many different ethical codes. Now, how do we talk to one another? Morality is a common language, if you like, that allows us to talk to each other and debate, even though we come from different ethical backgrounds. And I think Rabbi Sack thought that was of enormous importance. It clearly provided a situation within which minorities like the Jews, but other minorities as well, could thrive in an unprecedented way. And we're in danger, he thinks, of losing that commonality.
I know I didn't prepare this as a question, so I mean, feel free to bunt on it, Professor. But yeah. but the origin of this phrase morality, it comes out of Enlightenment philosophy. It comes.
Yes.
It comes. How does it emerge? Where does it come from?
Well, I think it's in the Enlightenment, and Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century is the greatest sort of early philosopher of morality. I think there's no question about that. And as I say, the idea is that there must be some sort of universal language, if you like. I think one of the things that Rabbi Sack says that's most helpful is to think about ethics in terms of different languages. So let's say that each community has its ethical code, each faith community, and so on, and they have their own language with their own ethical value words. So the first thing we would have to do to talk to each other would be to translate from one to the other. But the translation is not going to be neat. There may be concepts that don't quite fit, and there may be differences between what different communities value. So morality is the idea of a language that we have in common.
How would you define morality?
Well, I'm saying it's a language that can be used by people of different specific ethical backgrounds and commitments to discuss questions of value. There are sometimes other definitions that are given, and I'm not going to try to get into the moral philosophy details about that, because I noticed that Rabbi Sack doesn't. He really focuses on this question of a common language, right? If we're going to live together in a society, and we're going to take, and this is one of his main words throughout his career, collective responsibility, then we have to not only be able to translate from one language to another language, but to have a shared language in which we can talk about things. And what the great danger is that we are losing the commonality. We're losing the sense of the common good that allows us to be a we, rather than a bunch of individuals or a bunch of separate groups. And there are several reasons for that.
Yeah, please. Do you have an opinion as to why that's occurring now?
Yes, and I'm just trying to explain his view, but I certainly agree with a great deal of it as well. So one issue is secularization. It's not that is necessarily bad. But in the past, certainly in Kant's day in the late 18th century, people's ethics mainly came from their religious upbringings. And then they developed what in philosophy are called thin concepts of the good and the right and so on. And those sort of gained their content from the more specific upbringings that we have. But if you just had the thin concepts and you didn't have the thick concepts of a religious or other ethical upbringing, then you wouldn't be left with very much at all. So that's one problem. So secularization without some other sort of ethical community replacing traditional religious upbringing would be a problem. The second problem, Did
Kant attempt to replace this religious basis for morality?
Well, he has his own version of religion, which was very much based on Christianity. And of course, you'll see in the 19th century also, following Kant, some Jewish attempts to do that as well, to sort of universalize a Jewish picture of ethics, but in a way that other people from other backgrounds can relate to it as well. So it's a question of reinterpreting certain religious symbols and doctrines.
So if I'm understanding correctly, one of the reasons for the breakdown of morality is that with the secularization of society, right, exactly what was meant to replace the ethical teachings of the world's religions didn't necessarily solidify.
Yes.
And so we're left with a vacuum.
So that's one problem. Again,
Okay.
I'm not saying that a secular ethics is impossible or anything like that. But
I understand.
Yes, but if we don't have some replacement for the religious upbringing, some other kind of ethical upbringing, then it's a problem. Second problem is the individualism of the 1960s, a sort of liberalization of lifestyles. And again, there are lots of good things about individualism, Rabbi Sack thinks, but it's a fragmentation of society. And what used to be very considered very important ethical codes and values, really people started to rebel against them, but without really instituting something else that was collective. So it's liberating to be able to do your own thing, but ultimately, in the long run, that can be very bad for society. The third problem is.
Let me just. I just want to just for my own, just to make sure I'm keeping up with you. And so the second problem is that we have a focus on individuality and the development of the individual and the rights of the individual, but we don't necessarily have a replacement or a clear understanding of our obligation to community or our obligation to each other. So that's a second vacuum that we have.
Exactly. And in America in particular, I think that's a problem. As Rabbi Sacks points out, de Tocqueville already noted in the 19th century that America was a place of great individualism, but the way that it could cope with that was by having a very, very strong civil society. Not by having a strong state, or not by having religion rule everything, but by having voluntary associations in between, as it were, the state and the individual. And
how would you define a civil society? How would you define that? What does it mean?
That space of voluntary but collective action that comes in between the state and the individual. So it could be trade unions, it could be various political associations, it could be welfare associations.
So, but we need some sort of robust commitment to the development of ourselves as a community.
Yes, to taking collective responsibility, not only for perfecting ourselves individually, which is important, which was the 60s, that's what the 60s was about, but a collective responsibility, taking responsibility each for the other and for society as a whole. And the third factor, Rabbi Sacks thinks, is the damage to civil society that's been done by a pattern where, in the first place, the state took over some of the welfare functions of civil society. And he thinks that was a good thing. It wasn't a bad thing. In Britain, the National Health Service and welfare policies and so on, he certainly endorses those. However, then what happened was, in the age of austerity, after the recession, in the last 20 years or so, 15, 20 years, the state withdrew. But civil society had given up those functions, and nobody was there to help the poor and the vulnerable. and they were left in a vacuum as well. So civil society needs to be rebuilt. And the big worry that he has, finally, is that individuals feeling lost and lonely, especially in an age of social media, are going to try to form collectives that give them meaning in a dangerous way. And this is where populism and identity politics come into it. This is the formation of groups that define themselves by the exclusion of others. They're not really collective responsibility groups. So they are part of the fragmentation of civil society that makes it impossible to have a collective subject that is capable of engaging in moral discourse.
I think in my high school American history teacher would be proud of me. I think we're talking about factions, right? That's what we're right. We're talking about factions.
Yes.
Right, which are really just small communities that are functioning as individuals, but not taking collective responsibility.
Exactly.
So let me take a step back for a second, right? Going to your first point, by the way, if anybody has questions, they can post them on Facebook and we'll try to get to them. I see one question here from Gerald, and it has to be stated again. I don't quite understand the question. And if anybody else wants to ask a question on Facebook, please do at the H New York Facebook page. Let's take that first issue that if we're not going to base our morality on religion, right? And we want to create a new basis for our reality. Is it possible to create a moral framework on the basis of science? Is it provable philosophically? What would you or Rabbi Sacks, if you feel like you know his position, have to say about that?
Well, of course, Rabbi Sacks wrote a terrific book called The Great Partnership about the different contributions of religion and science, and ultimately he doesn't see them as competing. But I think his view would also be that science cannot really solve this problem. Now, there are some attempts to provide a sort of scientific basis for ethics in the popular work of Sam Harris, for example.
Right. He calls it human thriving.
Yes.
Right.
And actually, there's something slightly similar in the last chapter of Rabbi Sacks's supervisor, Bernard Williams' book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, where he also tries to revive the Aristotelian notion of human thriving with some psychological help. So for him, it's more a matter of psychology, and for Harris, it's more a matter of neuroscience. But the problem is that, okay, science can play some role here in especially social science. And in fact, the book Morality is largely engaging with the social scientific literature. Social science and psychology can help us to understand something about what works and what doesn't work for us. But what defines working and not working cannot itself be derived from the science, right? So maybe we can, to some extent, measure some quantitative aspects of human thriving scientifically, but that human thriving itself is the ultimate value, that is not something that science can possibly tell you. I mean, maybe human life is not good for the cosmos. Right? Who said it was? Why is human thriving good? So I think it can't tell you that. And also the qualitative features of human thriving, there are indefinitely many different ways in which human beings could thrive. And it's not obvious that what's good for one person is good for another. I don't think that science can resolve those questions. So it can contribute tremendously. The most popular class at Yale is my colleague Laurie Santos's class on happiness. Clearly, people want to know about that.
Right.
And I think that all that's helpful, but it can't fundamentally tell you what your values should be.
It's interesting what you said about that, because when I think of Sam Harris's comments on human thriving, right, I wonder to myself, but isn't that in competition with animal thriving? In other words, the question would be, maybe the planet Earth is better off without humans.
Exactly.
Which I think would probably be an easy argument to make from an environmentalist perspective, right?
Yes.
We'd have no depletion we'd have no global warming. We'd have no causing animals to become extinct. And so therefore, how can you derive from science the value that human beings add to planet Earth?
Yes. I don't think it can work. So I think Harris's argument is assuming on the basis of something else, whatever that is, that human thriving is a value. How can we measure it given science? How can we decide what it consists in? But that's not the same thing as science actually providing the value itself. And I think Rabbi Sacks puts it in a very different, much more helpful way when he talks about this and talks about what your fundamental ethical values are. He talks about falling in love with a certain ethical ideal or with ethical exemplars of a certain kind. In a similar way, he talks about religion not as something that is provable or not provable. He talks about it as hearing the music under the noise. And I think that aesthetic metaphor is much more appropriate.
It's helpful, but on the other hand, I mean, as a guide to trying to figure out, how a person should live their life, can we rely on something as effervescent as falling in love?
Well, hopefully that's not all we're relying on, but that's why we need the robust ethical communities within which to fall in love, right? So there have to be communities that exemplify these ideals. If not, then, as you say, the mere experience, the mere passion on its own, without the social context, I think would not be enough.
Okay, so I think we've arrived that it doesn't seem as if science itself can provide for us a replacement for what the strong religious content that used to exist in Western civilization. I didn't put that very well, but you get what I'm saying. That science can't replace it. Let me ask the question in a little bit of a confrontational way. Do you believe that an atheist can truly believe in morality?
Yes, but it's a more complicated picture than that, because as Rabbi Sack says, there are many moralities. So to go back to his picture of what morality is a sort of ethical language. It's an ethical language that is developed so that different ethical communities living in the same society can talk to each other and have moral debates and care about each other and take collective responsibility. So which particular, that's why he doesn't commit himself to any particular morality, whether it's utilitarianism or some sort of virtue theory or some sort of deontological principle-based ethics. These distinctions that moral philosophers make are not the key point of the book, right? Because every society has to develop its own moral language that enables its different subgroups to talk to one another. So there's no reason to think that atheists cannot do that. And in fact, moral philosophy in the West has developed extremely sophisticated ways of talking about morality without any commitment to God. If you're a religious person, you can take the very same moral notions and understand them as divine commands. But if you're not a religious person, or if you're an atheist, then there's another way to think about them without losing the sense of rigor and careful, considered deliberation.
And yet we're losing it.
Well, that's the problem with the fragmentation of civil society. People are talking to each other much less, and as I mentioned before, social media, Rabbi Sacks thought, was a very major problem. It's really creating these subgroups that don't talk to each other at all. And now, of course, he worries about a post-truth society where each group has its own facts. I don't want to get into politics, but I think we can recognize that that's a problem, that different subgroups don't talk to each other in the same way that they did. We don't. I mean, I mentioned the BBC before, but that probably dates me as being of a certain generation. I always listened to the BBC radio from being a child, but I don't think my kids' generation and others living in England do that in the same way now. They do whatever they're doing on the internet, and they have their own sources of information.
Right. You know, I had a rabbi in yeshiva who once said, if you're not allowed, they've removed in public schools in America, you can't teach religion, right?
Yes.
And so how I mean, how can we begin to, well, I guess what I'm asking is, you know, should morality be taught in public schools? What are potential solutions to this problem? But you know something? I know I just asked that question, but I'm going to stop in midstream because I just saw a question on the screen that relates more directly to what we're talking about right now. So I want to ask the question that I just see. I'm going to save that one for later. Um, 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 does the need for a common moral language to enable different ethical traditions to communicate imply that ethical systems are all relative, that none of them are universal, ours included?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think so. I don't think plurality entails relativity. But this is an interesting question from a Jewish point of view. And of course, Rabbi Sacks wrote a fascinating book about it called The Dignity of Difference. And you know, his view was that without the slightest compromise on his commitment to the truth of Judaism, he could also acknowledge that there was truth in other ethical and religious ways of life and views as well. That is part of the human condition. So obviously there may be cases where there's an actual disagreement. That's a different issue. But nevertheless, plurality is one thing and relativity is something else. And I think
just the fact that there are many opinions on an issue doesn't indicate that one of them might be correct universally.
Well, it doesn't involve it doesn't imply that one of them might be correct,
less correct,
to the exclusion of all the others.
Right. Just the fact that many people disagree about morality doesn't say anything about whether or not a universal morality could or should or does exist.
Yes. And of course, Judaism has a universal dimension embodied in the 7 mitzvahs of the Bnei Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments. But I think that is a sort of model for Rabbi Sacks of morality. Right? Judaism, for the most part, is about how Jews should act. But it also has a universal aspect in which it talks about what are the most important values, that you should have courts of justice, let's say. It doesn't say what those courts of justice should be like or what the justice system should be for other nations. And that has to be subject to how they develop it. But in the Noachide commandments, Judaism has a sort of model already for morality. Judaism does not give up its particularity, nor does it give up its own claim to truth. But it provides a framework within which different nations, different ethical backgrounds can talk to one another.
I see. So if we define morality as the ability of different ethical cultures to communicate with each other, and that's breaking down, right? Do you see any possible solutions for that?
Yes, I think there is hope, and I think Rabbi Sacks was a person of hope. And incidentally, he mentions a book that influenced him a great deal, which was written by a former colleague of mine, Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue. I used to teach at the University of Notre Dame, and McIntyre was a wonderful colleague there. And McIntyre ends that book on a note of despair and says, look, you know, everything is basically ruined, and all we can do is retreat into whatever the equivalent of the monasteries are now. He's a Catholic philosopher, and just wait for the Dark Ages to be over. And Rabbi Sacks says, no, let's, you know, Judaism is a religion of hope. We can do this partly because we've done it before. Civil society hasn't always existed. It had to be built, and there are ways in which we can can do that. We can promote it. And actually, if I can come back to the question about high school, I think this is related, because I think, you know, that's a very important educational developmental stage for people.
Right, right.
So, okay, not teaching religion in American high schools, but maybe people have heard of the Ethics Bowl. And I think that's a great thing, which we have at the university level as well as at the high school level. And in Ethics Bowl, it's a sort of a debating society, but it's different from debate, because you're not just sort of given arbitrarily some position and then defend it no matter whether you agree with it or not. You're given a complex moral question,
right.
and you have to develop a position on that moral question and a defense of it, and then you have to be responsive to other groups' criticisms. And that, I think, is a wonderful thing. And if you listen, as I said, to Rabbi Sack's podcast, to the bits where he's talking to high school students, that's exactly what he does with them. And he allows them to speak and listens to them and responds to them, but he also encourages them to engage with each other. That, to me, would be a wonderful way of teaching morality.
You know, it's amazing that you mentioned that, because in my own personal journey in my life, I went to basically a secular private school growing up, and then I was kind of encountered Talmudic thinking and Judaism later in my life, and one of the most exciting things for me personally was that I was suddenly in all of these ethical conversations, which really pushed my own. I'd never forced myself to try to think through a moral dilemma in a sophisticated way, and I think that high schoolers and young people would be very interested in doing that, but for some reason, and maybe the cause of it is, I don't know what the cause is, but why isn't that happening in schools at a young age?
I can't answer why it's not happening, but I think
I can't either.
It should. And I know that. So when I used to teach at the University of Toronto as well, and my department at the University of Toronto really encouraged high school philosophy classes in the province of Ontario, and we helped develop a curriculum and an essay prize that we used to judge. And I would go into different high schools and encourage them to debate, and so did my colleagues. And I think that would be a great thing to do in America. I don't think there's very much philosophy, including moral philosophy, in American high schools. You can do philosophy, as I did, at high school in England.
So you know, there's a question I see here on Facebook that I think might actually relate to our discussion very directly. The question is like this, and let me give a little statement afterwards to explain why I think it might relate to us. The answer is, don't we get our values? The question is, don't we get our values from a combination of community and education? But education, whether from university or religion or the state, can also become corrupted. And what I see lying behind that question is a sort of feeling that it's futile. That you know, intricate discussions about right and wrong and morality, right? They're just going to end up in long discussions. We're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to actually be able to discover anything fundamental. How do you deal with a person who feels that way or feels cynical like that?
Right. So, in fact, Rabbi Sacks mentions cynicism, and as you would guess, it's something that he rejects. Look, people are altruistic. They're naturally altruistic. People care about other people, and you know, it's been shown that even very small children can show concern about others. And maybe that's something that can be lost or it can be damaged in some way, but it's there to be worked with in the first instance. That's the first thing that I would say. The second, again, going with what Rabbi Sack says in the book, is that the stories we tell ourselves and each other really matter. The meaningfulness or the meaninglessness of our lives depends on our ability to tell a certain story. And in order to tell a story, you need concepts. So I think it does make a difference if we have these debates, and if students start to use moral concepts and to reflect on how they would make decisions. Of course, they may not always live up to it in real life, but sometimes they will. And the way that they will think about themselves and about their community will change. The stories we tell really matter. And morality is a very large part of that story.
See, I wasn't so much thinking that they won't live up to what they're saying, but I'm talking about the feeling that a discussion about morality is just going to end up being, you know, we're never going to really figure it out. So therefore, why should I waste my time thinking about it?
Well, perhaps that is the wrong goal. I mean, figuring it out as if it were a mathematical problem does not seem to be the right way to approach a moral dilemma. It's a question of developing the conceptual tools or the linguistic tools for talking about it and thinking about it and negotiating it. It may not stop being a problem, but it's going to be a problem that we can talk about. And that means it's a problem that we can engage with in better ways, and we can correct the ways in which we've dealt with it before. So I think that's helpful. It's not going to reach a settled solution and tell you this is the absolutely right thing to do, and there's no more question about it. That's not the way human life is. I mean, it's the same issue in general about philosophy, right? Why hasn't philosophy made progress by solving all the big problems of what it is to lead a meaningful life? Well, because that's not what the way human life is, I think. It has made progress by developing lots of alternative concepts and for how to live, and ways to discuss it, and rigorous ways of objecting and defending certain positions. But it's not going to give you a solution the way a piece of mathematics does.
So in a way, the answer to this question is it might become corrupted. It's true. It might not be right, but simply the engagement of the discussion itself and the discovery of the concepts and the words to discuss these issues could elevate us, could get us to a new ability to communicate and to commit to values collectively.
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting that you mentioned before Talmudic argument and discussion, and I think it's very much related. It's not the same project of morality, but it's certainly debate about values. And there's very often, as you well know, no resolution in a sugya, in a Talmudic topic, but that doesn't take away, doesn't detract in any way from the value of the discussion, which makes us refine our concepts and think about the way we're acting and the way we're talking in improved ways, and the way we deal with each other, the way we treat each other.
You know, I find this particular back and forth very inspiring, because if there was some way to invigorate, you know, I think a lot of people are thirsty for this type of talk. A lot of podcasts. Like the popularity of Jordan Peterson, the popularity of a lot of long-form discussions that Sam Harris is having. We see that there's a thirst for the discussion itself. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's right. Let's talk about what's wrong. Let's talk about whether religion is important or it's not important. I think there's a real thirst out there. Do you feel that as well?
Absolutely. Yes, I do. Yes.
So, okay, shifting for a second. Rabbi Sack's first chapter in the book is on loneliness. Would you talk a little bit about what you feel, how that relates to morality? I mean, it's such a appropriate thing to think about now during this lockdown.
Yes, and in fact, the epilogue to the book, which was written later during the time of the pandemic, says exactly that. Right? When he wrote the book itself, it was before the pandemic.
Right.
So the great danger to morality, as we were saying before, is the fragmentation of civil society, the loss of association, the fragmentation into individualism, and so on. And loneliness is a very big part of that. People are lonely. They were lonely even before the pandemic. They're even lonelier now. So he talks about the appointment of a so-called minister for loneliness in the British government. I don't think that's the official title, but basically someone to deal with that problem. And that's again because of the decay of voluntary associations. You know, even if you weren't a member of the church, or maybe you were a member, but you would be a member of the union, or you would have your local pub to go to, or whatever it was. That you would be in the village and you would know people. That's not the case anymore. People are, even before the pandemic, holed up at home. They may not have that much interaction with people, or they have interaction online, which is not nothing, but it doesn't really substitute. I think we're clear about that, and we're even clearer about it during the pandemic, when it's pretty much all most of us have. It's okay, but it's not really a substitute for actual social interaction. And I think the reason for that is that it doesn't really foster collective responsibility. Right? And so what Rabbi Sack says about religious association in particular is that it forms what he calls a covenantal community. And that's a very important term for him in this and other books. A covenant is not a contract. It is a sort of a commitment to care about one another. And religion has been extremely effective in establishing that sort of community. Again, I'm not saying only religion can do it. There may be other ways to do it, but that happens to be the way in which religion has been effective in the past. It's also effective because it does this in a very long-term way. It's not just some club that's going to exist for a couple of years and then fade away, or something that will cease to exist when it's achieved its purpose. It's a permanent covenantal community. Wow. So I think loneliness is a big problem for him, because it indicates exactly the loss of civil society that is at the same time the cause for the decay of morality.
So we have a lack of community, we have a lack of collective philosophy or religion, and we need to begin talking to each other and rebuilding these things. I'm going to ask a last question, actually, from our from our studio producer here. It's a great question. I think he's asking like this. Is altruism essential to morality, or could people choose to cooperate and communicate just out of self-interest?
So there's a lot of philosophical discussion about whether you can get from pure self-interest to morality. In other words, whether you could show that it was in somebody's self-interest to engage in morality. But I think the assumption is that morality itself is altruistic, that it involves some sort of collective responsibility. It can be defined in many different ways. There can be forms of ethics, perhaps, that are entirely individualistic and self-directed. But I think as morality has developed, because of the role it has played socially, the sort of ethical language that we would use to speak across different communities goes together with the idea of a common good. And the idea of a common good is not only the idea that it's good for each one of us somehow to participate, but that it's good for all of us, that we constitute a community, that we are a we and not just an aggregate of I's.
And that we want good for the other.
Yes.
Not for our own sake, but for theirs.
Exactly.
I hear. Okay.
Yes. And incidentally, Rabbi Sack's dissertation was called Collective Responsibility in Jewish Law. So I think that was his theme throughout his career, starting very early on.
Oh, well, it's been an amazing discussion, really enjoyable and interesting and exciting, Professor. I hope you feel that Rabbi Sacks would be proud of it.
Yes, I think so. And he's very greatly missed. He would be telling great stories and jokes in this conversation, and I miss those, and I miss the sound of his voice tremendously. Okay, well,
his soul should go up and have an aliyah, as we say. The Neshama should have an aliyah, and we should all be inspired by his altruism and his desire to bring communities together. And I hope this discussion goes in some small way to help that occur. And I can't thank you enough for participating and for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it's been very valuable.
Okay, thank you kindly. Okay, good night, everybody, and we'll see you next week on H New York Thursday Night Live. Oh, it's Thanksgiving. We might not see you. We'll see. Okay. Have a Shabbat Shalom.